My name is Dr. Tobias Kelleher, and I'm an archaeologist who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted, my knowledge of ancient survival techniques became the difference between life and death for my group. I had to choose between preserving history and keeping people alive in a world where modern technology failed overnight. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Tobias Kelleher, and what I'm about to tell you happened exactly 5 months ago. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life digging through the remnants of dead civilizations, trying to understand how people survived when their world fell apart. I specialized in industrial archaeology, particularly the machinery and infrastructure from the early 1900s. You might think that studying old steam engines and coal-powered equipment would be useless in the modern world, but you'd be wrong. Dead wrong. On August 15th, 2025, I was knee-deep in an excavation pit outside Billings, Montana. The site was an abandoned mining operation from the 1920s, and we'd been working there for 3 weeks, carefully documenting every piece of corroded metal and broken machinery we found. The temperature that morning had already hit 92 degrees by 10 o'clock, and I remember complaining to my graduate assistant Sarah about the heat as I photographed what looked like a water pump housing. Sarah Chen had been working with me for 2 years. She was brilliant, methodical, and had an incredible eye for detail that made her invaluable in the field. That morning, she was 20 feet away from me, carefully brushing sediment off what we thought might be part of an old generator. The dig site was surrounded by rolling hills covered in dry grass, the kind of landscape that screams fire danger during Montana summers. We had no idea that fire would be the least of our worries. I was adjusting my camera settings when the ground started to shake. At first, I thought it was just another minor tremor. Montana gets them all the time, little reminders that we're sitting on top of geological forces we barely understand. But this one was different. It started small, just enough to rattle the tools on my folding table, but it kept building. The shaking got stronger and stronger until my teeth were chattering, and the excavation ladder was bouncing against the pit wall. Sarah grabbed onto that ladder and shouted something I couldn't hear over the growing rumble. The sound was like a freight train, but deeper, more fundamental. It felt like the earth itself was groaning. I looked up from my camera and saw her pointing toward the southwest, her face white with terror. I followed her gaze and saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The horizon had turned orange. Not the gentle orange of a sunset, but a violent, angry orange that hurt to look at. A massive column of ash and smoke was rising into the sky, so tall and wide that it seemed to punch through the clouds themselves. Even from what I later learned was nearly 300 miles away, Yellowstone's eruption looked like the end of the world. The column was growing by the second, spreading outward like an umbrella of destruction. I knew immediately what we were looking at because I'd spent years studying civilizations that had faced similar disasters. The Tambora eruption in 1815 had caused what historians called the year without a summer. Crops failed across the globe, people starved, entire societies collapsed, but Yellowstone was different. Yellowstone was a supervolcano, and when supervolcanoes blow, they don't just affect one growing season. They can change the climate for decades. The shaking lasted for almost 10 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Sarah and I climbed out of the pit and stood there staring at that growing ash cloud. Neither of us spoke for a long time. What was there to say? We both understood enough geology to know that our lives had just changed forever. I made the decision to pack up immediately. Sarah wanted to secure the artifacts properly, to follow protocol, but I told her to leave everything except the essential equipment. Something in my voice must have convinced her because she didn't argue. We threw our cameras and field notes into the truck and started driving back toward Billings. The whole time, that ash cloud kept growing behind us, spreading across the sky like spilled ink. The drive back to the university normally took 45 minutes. That day, it took almost 2 hours because everyone else had the same idea we did. The roads were packed with people trying to get home, trying to get to their families, trying to get somewhere that felt safe. Radio stations were broadcasting emergency bulletins, but the information was scattered and contradictory. Some stations were saying it was just a minor eruption. Others were already talking about evacuation zones and emergency shelters. I knew better. I'd studied enough volcanic disasters to understand the scale of what we were dealing with. Yellowstone sits on top of a magma chamber that's roughly 30 miles wide. When it erupts, it doesn't just send up a little smoke. It releases the energy equivalent of thousands of nuclear weapons. The ash cloud I was watching grow would circle the globe within days, blocking out sunlight and dropping global temperatures by degrees that most ecosystems couldn't handle. By the time we reached the university, the first ash was already starting to fall. It looked like snow, but it was warm and gritty, and it tasted like sulfur when you accidentally got some in your mouth. The campus was in chaos. Students were trying to contact their families. Faculty members were glued to news broadcasts. The administration was talking about closing the school indefinitely. Sarah and I went to my office in the archaeology building and started monitoring the emergency broadcasts. The reports kept getting worse. Yellowstone had erupted with more force than anyone had predicted. The initial blast had been heard as far away as Denver. Seismographs across the western United States had registered readings that broke their scales. Most terrifying of all, this wasn't just one eruption. The caldera was still active, still spewing ash and volcanic material into the atmosphere. That first night, we huddled in my office with Dr. Elena Martinez from the geology department and 3 undergraduate students who couldn't get home because the highways were already becoming impassable. The ash was falling steadily now, coating everything in a layer of gray powder that got thicker by the hour. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning, and it was still falling. Dr. Martinez had been studying Yellowstone for her entire career. She explained that what we were experiencing was just the beginning. The ash cloud would continue to spread and thicken. It would block sunlight across huge portions of the northern hemisphere. Temperatures would keep dropping as less and less solar energy reached the ground. Agriculture would fail. Supply chains would collapse. The modern world was about to experience what scientists called a volcanic winter. But I knew something that Dr. Martinez didn't. I knew how people had survived similar disasters in the past. I'd spent years studying the archaeological evidence of civilizations that had endured climate catastrophes. I understood the technologies and techniques that had kept humans alive when their world turned hostile. More importantly, I knew where we could find those technologies in working condition. The excavation site we'd been working at wasn't just an abandoned mine. It was a complete industrial operation from the 1920s, built during a time when people understood that technology could fail, and that survival sometimes meant going back to older, simpler methods. The buildings were constructed to withstand harsh Montana winters. The equipment was designed to work without electricity or modern fuel sources. Most importantly, I'd been studying the site's documentation for months, and I'd found references to resources and infrastructure that the original owners had hidden or sealed away. On the second day, when the ash fall was so heavy that driving had become nearly impossible, and the power grid was starting to fail under the strain of increased demand, I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. I told the group we were going back to the excavation site, not to continue our research but to survive. Some of them thought I was crazy. The site was 20 miles outside of town, in the middle of nowhere, with no modern amenities. But I explained what I'd learned from studying historical disasters. Cities become death traps when supply systems fail. Rural locations with existing infrastructure and natural resources offer the best chance of long-term survival. More importantly, The 1920s mining operation had been designed by people who understood that survival sometimes meant being completely self-sufficient. Sarah was the first to agree with me. She'd worked at the site long enough to understand the potential of what we'd found there. Dr. Martinez took longer to convince, but her knowledge of volcanic winters made her realize that staying in town was ultimately hopeless. The undergraduate students didn't really have anywhere else to go. Their families were scattered across states that were already being evacuated or cut off by ash fall. We spent the rest of that second day gathering supplies from the university. I raided the archaeology department's equipment storage for tools that would be useful in a low-technology environment. Hand tools, measuring devices, camping gear, anything that didn't require electricity or modern fuel. Dr. Martinez collected geological survey maps and weather monitoring equipment. Sarah focused on medical supplies and preserved food. The local residents we picked up on the way out of town were Frank and Rose Kowalski, an elderly couple whose house was right on our route to the site. They'd been married for 53 years and had lived through enough Montana winters to understand the value of preparation and hard work. Frank had been a mechanic before he retired, and Rose had taught home economics for 30 years. They brought practical skills that would prove invaluable in the days ahead. The drive to the excavation site on day 3 was like traveling through a different planet. The ash fall had turned the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. Visibility was less than 100 yards. The ash was so thick on the roads that we had to drive in first gear to avoid getting stuck. Trees were bending under the weight of accumulated ash. Animals were behaving strangely, clustering together in whatever shelter they could find. When we finally reached the site, I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief because the old mining buildings were still standing, their solid 1920s construction proving more durable than modern structures. Terror because I realized the full weight of responsibility I'd taken on. These people were trusting me to keep them alive based on my knowledge of dead civilizations and abandoned technologies. The main building of the mining operation was a 2-story structure built from local stone and heavy timber. It had been designed to house the mine's administrative offices and equipment storage. The walls were 3 feet thick, built to insulate against Montana winters that could drop to 40 below zero. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow, and the windows were small and deeply recessed to minimize heat loss. Inside, we found exactly what I'd hoped for. The mining company had left behind a treasure trove of 1920s industrial equipment. Steam-powered generators, coal-burning heating systems, hand-operated water pumps, mechanical tools that didn't need electricity. Everything was corroded and covered in decades of dust, but the basic machinery was intact. More importantly, I'd found the original documentation for all of it during my research. The mining company records, which I'd been studying for historical context, suddenly became survival manuals. They contained detailed diagrams of the heating and ventilation systems, maintenance schedules for the equipment, and most importantly, maps of the entire mine complex including sections that had been sealed off when operations ended in 1923. That first night at the site, while the others worked on clearing living space and organizing our supplies, I studied those records by lantern light. What I found made me realize that our situation was both better and worse than I'd thought. Better because the mining operation had been designed as a completely self-sufficient community. Worse because the records contained references to problems that had forced the miners to seal off large sections of the underground complex. The temperature outside had dropped to 38 degrees. In August, in Montana, the ash was still falling steadily, and the radio broadcasts we could still receive were painting a picture of global catastrophe. Airports shut down worldwide, major cities losing power, supply chains completely broken. The volcanic winter had begun, and it was happening faster than anyone had predicted. But we had shelter, and we had the knowledge to make that shelter work. The old coal-burning heating system just needed cleaning and minor repairs to be functional again. The hand-operated water pump could access the site's original well. The food storage areas were dry and secure. Most importantly, the mining records suggested that there were resources hidden in the sealed sections of the mine that could sustain us through a winter that might last for years. On day 4, while Frank worked on getting the heating system operational and Rose organized our food supplies into rationing schedules, Sarah and I started documenting everything we could find in the mining company records. What we discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The mine had been abandoned not because the coal seam was exhausted, but because the miners had encountered something they couldn't handle safely. The records from 1923 mentioned gas concerns and structural instability in the deeper sections. More intriguingly, they referenced emergency protocols and survival supplies that had been stockpiled in the sealed areas. The mining company had been preparing for something, some kind of disaster that would require long-term underground survival. They'd built a system that could sustain dozens of people for months, maybe years, completely cut off from the outside world. By day 5, we had the basic systems working: heat, water, secure food storage, and sleeping areas that stayed warm even as the outside temperature continued to drop. But I knew this was just the beginning. The ash cloud was spreading globally, and the cooling effect would intensify over the coming weeks and months. We needed to access those sealed sections of the mine if we were going to survive what was coming. The problem was that the sealed sections were dangerous. The mining records made that clear. Whatever had driven the miners to abandon profitable operations and seal off entire sections of their complex was still down there, waiting for us. But as the temperature outside dropped to freezing on day 6 and a massive blizzard began forming on the horizon, I realized we might not have a choice. That night, as we huddled around the old coal stove listening to the wind howl outside and watching the snow pile up against our windows, I explained to the group what I'd found in the mining records. The sealed sections contained resources we needed, but accessing them would be dangerous. We could stay where we were and hope our current supplies lasted until the volcanic winter ended, or we could take the risk of exploring the areas the original miners had deemed too dangerous to work. The decision would have to wait until morning, but as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the storm rage outside, I knew what we'd have to do. The blizzard that was burying us was just the beginning. The real winter was still coming, and when it arrived, the shallow resources of the upper levels wouldn't be enough to keep us alive. We'd have to go deeper, into the parts of the mine that the original operators had sealed away for reasons they'd taken to their graves. The mining records suggested that what we'd find down there could save us all, but they also suggested that some things were sealed away because they were too dangerous to leave accessible. Tomorrow, we'd have to decide which risk was greater: facing the unknown dangers below ground, or slowly freezing and starving in the relatively safe upper levels, while the world above us died under a blanket of volcanic ash and ice. The blizzard that hit us on day 6 lasted 14 hours. When we woke up on day 7, there were 4 feet of snow against our windows, and the temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees below zero. In August, the volcanic winter had arrived with a vengeance, and we were about to learn just how unprepared the modern world was for what our ancestors would have called a normal winter. But we survived that first blizzard because I understood something that most people had forgotten. The coal-burning heating system we'd restored wasn't just functional, it was designed for exactly these conditions. The miners who built this place in the 1920s knew how to keep people alive when the temperature dropped and stayed down for months at a time. They'd engineered every aspect of the heating system to burn efficiently and retain heat in the massive stone walls of the building. While the storm raged outside, I spent hours studying the maintenance manuals we'd found with the mining equipment. These weren't just instruction booklets. They were detailed guides written by people who understood that their survival depended on keeping their equipment working through harsh winters and equipment failures. Every system had backups. Every backup had manual overrides. Every manual override was designed to work with tools and materials that could be found or manufactured on site. Sarah had been helping me translate the technical drawings and specifications, but she was also keeping watch on our group dynamics. Smart woman. She'd noticed something I'd been too focused on the technical problems to see clearly. Frank and Rose Kowalski were solid, experienced people who understood hardship and hard work. Dr. Martinez brought scientific knowledge that complemented my historical expertise. But the three undergraduate students were starting to crack under the pressure. Two of them, Jessica and Michael, had been talking about leaving ever since we arrived at the site. They wanted to head for Denver or Salt Lake City, convinced that the government would establish relief centers in the major cities. They couldn't understand that those cities were going to become death traps once their food supplies ran out and their heating systems failed. The third student, David, wasn't talking about leaving, but he wasn't contributing much either. He spent most of his time staring out the windows at the accumulating snow. On day 8, the storm finally broke, and we got our first clear look at what the world had become. The landscape was completely transformed. The rolling hills were buried under snow that would normally be unthinkable in August. The ash mixed with the snow had created a gray slush that coated everything in a layer of gritty ice. But more disturbing were the sounds, or rather, the lack of sounds. No aircraft overhead, no distant traffic, no electronic hum from power lines or cell towers. The world had gone silent except for the wind. That morning, we heard vehicles approaching. I thought it might be emergency services or military personnel conducting search and rescue operations, but when I looked out through our small window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a convoy of civilian vehicles, loaded down with supplies and moving slowly through the snow. But these weren't refugees seeking shelter. These were people who'd already adapted to the new reality, and they were armed. The convoy stopped about 200 yards from our building. I counted 8 vehicles and at least 20 people. They sent 2 representatives to our door, a man and woman who introduced themselves as Tom and Linda from a survival group that had formed in Billings. They'd heard radio chatter about people heading to rural locations and were checking on isolated groups to see if they needed assistance or wanted to join their larger community. I appreciated their caution and their organization, but something about their offer didn't sit right with me. They were very interested in what supplies we had and what resources the site might contain. They asked detailed questions about the mining equipment and whether we'd explored the underground sections. When I mentioned that we'd found sealed areas, their interest sharpened noticeably. After they left, promising to check back in a few days, I had a long conversation with our group about what their visit meant. Other people were thinking the same way we were, but they were thinking bigger and more aggressively. The survival group from Billings had obviously done their homework about rural sites with existing infrastructure. They were mapping resources and evaluating targets for potential expansion or acquisition. Frank, who'd lived through enough economic hardships to understand human nature under pressure, put it bluntly. Give it another week or two, and friendly visits would become demands for cooperation. Give it a month, and demands would become ultimatums backed by force. We needed to be prepared for the possibility that other survivors would view our site and our resources as things they needed more than we did. That afternoon, while the others worked on reinforcing our defenses and improving our heating efficiency, I made a decision that would define everything that happened next. I started seriously studying the sealed sections of the mine complex, not just the references in the mining company records, but the actual physical access points and the reasons they'd been sealed. The mining operation had 3 main levels. The upper level, where we were living, contained the administrative offices, equipment storage, and processing facilities. The middle level housed the primary mining operations and the main coal extraction areas. The lower level was where things got interesting. According to the records, the lower level contained not just additional coal seams, but also natural caves that the miners had connected to their tunnel system for storage and emergency shelter. But there were problems with the lower level. The 1923 records mentioned gas accumulation, structural instability, and what they called unusual acoustic phenomena. The miners had sealed multiple access points after several incidents that weren't clearly described in the documentation. Whatever had happened down there, it had been serious enough to abandon profitable mining operations and invest significant resources in permanent closure. On day 9, Jessica and Michael finally made their decision to leave. They'd convinced themselves that staying at the mining site was a dead end, that we were just postponing the inevitable. They wanted to try to reach Denver before the winter got worse. I tried to explain that Denver was probably already overwhelmed with refugees and that the infrastructure failures would be worse in high-population areas, but they weren't listening. Frank offered to give them extra supplies and equipment for their journey. Rose packed them food that would have lasted us several days. I gave them copies of the regional maps and marked the locations of other rural sites that might offer shelter, but I knew we were probably never going to see them again. The combination of hostile weather, failed infrastructure, and the breakdown of social order made long-distance travel effectively suicidal. After they left, our group was down to 6 people. Me, Sarah, Dr. Martinez, Frank, Rose, and David. Smaller, but more cohesive. Everyone who remained had made a conscious choice to commit to long-term survival at the site rather than hoping for rescue or return to normal life. We could work more efficiently and make decisions more quickly. That evening, I shared with the group what I'd learned about the sealed sections. I explained that accessing the lower levels would be dangerous, but that the resources down there might be essential for surviving a volcanic winter that could last for years. The mining records suggested that the lower level contained not just additional coal seams, but also natural cave systems that had been converted into storage areas and emergency shelters. Dr. Martinez had been conducting her own analysis of the volcanic ash samples and the climate data we could still receive from emergency radio broadcasts. Her conclusions were grimmer than even I had expected. The ash cloud was thicker and more persistent than the worst-case scenarios had predicted. Global temperatures were dropping faster than climate models had suggested was possible. The volcanic winter could last not just months, but years, maybe decades. That news changed everything. Our current supplies and the resources of the upper levels might last through a normal winter, but they wouldn't sustain us through years of volcanic winter. We needed access to the deeper resources, regardless of the risks involved. On day 10, I began the systematic exploration of the sealed access points. The miners had been thorough. They'd used heavy timber and metal plating to block the entrances to the lower levels, and they'd done it in a way that suggested permanence rather than temporary closure. Whatever they'd encountered down there, they'd wanted to make sure it stayed isolated. But 70 years of weather and settling had created gaps in their seals. More importantly, my archaeological training had taught me how to identify and safely remove historical construction without damaging important structures or triggering collapses. I spent most of day 10 carefully documenting the sealed entrances and developing plans for safe access. The first breakthrough came when I found a ventilation shaft that connected the upper level to the lower caves. The shaft had been sealed, but not as thoroughly as the main entrances. I was able to create a small opening that would allow us to lower equipment and, eventually, people into the lower level without compromising the structural integrity of the seals. But when I dropped a flashlight down the shaft and peered through the opening, what I saw made me understand why the miners had been so determined to keep people out of the lower level. The caves were extensive, much larger than the mining records had suggested. More disturbing, I could see evidence of structural modifications that weren't mentioned in any of the documentation we'd found. Someone had done significant work down there, work that had been deliberately omitted from the official records. That night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was lying in my sleeping bag studying the mining records by flashlight. The building was quiet except for the sound of wind outside and the occasional settling of the old timber beams. Then I heard something else. It was faint, but distinct. It sounded like machinery running deep underground. I lay still for several minutes, listening carefully. The sound was rhythmic, mechanical, like an engine or generator running at low speed. But that was impossible. We'd accounted for all the equipment in the upper levels, and none of it was running. The sealed lower levels shouldn't have had any functional machinery. Yet the sound was definitely coming from below us, and it was definitely mechanical. I didn't mention what I'd heard to the others the next morning. Not yet. I needed to understand what was producing that sound before I created panic or made decisions based on incomplete information. But I also knew that we were running out of time to make those decisions safely. The temperature outside was continuing to drop. Our food supplies were dwindling faster than we'd projected, and the friendly visit from the Billings survival group was due to be repeated any day. Day 11 brought new challenges and new discoveries. David, our remaining undergraduate student, had been working on expanding our radio monitoring capabilities. He'd rigged an antenna system that could pick up emergency broadcasts from across the region. What we learned from those broadcasts was sobering. The federal government had declared martial law in 17 states. Major cities were reporting massive casualties from cold exposure and supply failures. International trade had essentially stopped. The global economy was collapsing as countries focused on domestic survival. But David had also picked up something else. Local radio chatter from survival groups and armed communities that were forming across Montana and Wyoming. Some of them were cooperative organizations focused on mutual aid and resource sharing. Others were much more aggressive, talking about territorial control and resource acquisition by any means necessary. The Billings group that had visited us fell somewhere in the middle, but the trend was clearly toward militarization and competition. That afternoon, while Sarah and Dr. Martinez worked on improving our food preservation systems, I made the decision to access the lower level. I couldn't wait any longer for perfect safety or complete information. The risks of staying uninformed were becoming greater than the risks of exploration. I started with the ventilation shaft I'd opened the previous day. I rigged a rope system that would allow me to descend safely and, more importantly, ascend quickly if I encountered problems. I brought multiple flashlights, a portable radio for communication with the surface, and tools for basic excavation and defense. The descent into the lower level was like traveling back in time. The caves were natural limestone formations that had been modified and expanded by the miners. But the modifications were far more extensive than the official records had indicated. The miners had created a complete underground complex with multiple chambers, connecting tunnels and sophisticated ventilation systems. More importantly, they'd stockpiled supplies. Lots of supplies. The first chamber I explored contained hundreds of pounds of preserved food, medical supplies, tools, and equipment that had been sealed in waterproof containers. The second chamber held coal reserves that could heat our building for months. The third chamber contained something that made me realize the full scope of what the 1920s miners had been preparing for. It was a complete workshop, equipped with tools and machinery for manufacturing everything from basic household items to complex mechanical equipment. They'd built a facility that could sustain a community through years of isolation from the outside world. They'd anticipated exactly the kind of disaster we were facing, and they'd prepared for it with a thoroughness that put modern emergency planning to shame. But they'd also left warning signs. Painted messages on the walls cautioned about dangerous gases in certain areas. Structural markers indicated zones where cave-ins were possible. Most disturbing, there were references to sections of the cave system that had been deliberately collapsed to prevent access to even deeper areas. As I explored deeper into the complex, I began to understand what I'd been hearing during the night. Some of the machinery down there was still functional. Not running, but maintained in working condition by the stable temperature and low humidity of the caves. With minor repairs and fresh fuel, equipment that had been installed in the 1920s could be brought back to full operation. The miners hadn't just built a survival shelter. They'd built a complete underground civilization designed to function independently for as long as necessary. They'd done it because they understood something that modern people had forgotten. Disasters don't just disrupt normal life temporarily. Real disasters change the world permanently, and the only way to survive them is to be prepared for a completely different way of living. When I returned to the surface and reported what I'd found, the reaction from our group was mixed. Frank and Rose understood immediately. They'd lived through enough hardships to recognize the value of thorough preparation. Dr. Martinez was fascinated by the engineering challenges and the long-term planning involved. Sarah was excited about the archaeological significance of the discovery, but David was terrified. The idea of living underground for months or years was overwhelming to him. He started talking about claustrophobia and isolation, about the psychological effects of being cut off from the outside world. I tried to explain that the underground complex offered our best chance of long-term survival, but he was focused on the immediate psychological discomfort rather than the long-term physical necessity. That night, as we discussed plans for moving essential supplies and people to the lower level, I heard the mechanical sounds again. But this time, I wasn't the only one who heard them. Frank noticed them too, and his reaction told me that he understood what they might mean. Somewhere in the deeper sections of the cave system, machinery was running. Not just maintained, but actively operational. The 1920s miners had sealed off the upper levels and disappeared from the historical record, but their preparations had continued to function for 70 years. We weren't just discovering an abandoned shelter. We were finding a system that had been designed to operate autonomously, waiting for the next group of survivors who would need what the miners had built. But that raised new questions about what else might be down there, still running, still waiting. The mining records had mentioned problems that forced the abandonment of the surface operations. If the underground systems had continued to operate for 70 years, what had happened to the people who'd built them? And what were we going to find when we explored the sections that had been considered too dangerous to access even during the original crisis? Tomorrow, we'd begin the full transition to underground survival. We'd move our essential supplies and equipment to the lower level and start learning how to operate the systems the miners had left behind. But tonight, listening to the sound of machinery running in the depths beneath us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to discover that some preparations for disaster are more comprehensive and more disturbing than anyone expects. Day 12 marked the beginning of our transition to what I was starting to think of as Phase 2 of our survival. The upper level had served us well during those first critical days, but the resources I'd discovered in the lower caves made it clear that we'd been operating at subsistence level when we could have been thriving. The 1920s miners hadn't just prepared for disaster, they'd prepared to rebuild civilization from the ground up. The first challenge was moving our essential equipment and supplies through the ventilation shaft I'd opened. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, and the drop to the cave floor was 38 feet. Frank, who'd spent years rigging equipment for automotive repair shops, designed a pulley system that would allow us to lower supplies safely and efficiently. More importantly, he rigged it so that one person could operate the system from either the upper or lower level. Sarah volunteered to be the first person to make the full descent to help coordinate the supply transfer from below. Her trust in my exploration and her willingness to commit to the underground option helped convince David that this wasn't a desperate last resort, but a strategic advantage. Rose began organizing our supplies into priorities: critical equipment first, then preserved food, then comfort items and non-essential gear. But while we were organizing the transition, Dr. Martinez made a discovery that changed our timeline dramatically. She'd been monitoring the emergency radio broadcasts and tracking weather data, and her analysis painted a picture that was even worse than we'd feared. The volcanic ash cloud was not dissipating as quickly as the climate models had predicted. Worse, it was interacting with existing weather patterns to create what meteorologists were calling a feedback loop. The ash was blocking sunlight, which was cooling the atmosphere, which was causing more precipitation, which was bringing more ash to the ground, which was creating more localized cooling. The effect was compounding itself. Instead of gradual recovery over months or years, we were looking at accelerating deterioration that could last for decades. The volcanic winter wasn't just beginning, it was intensifying. That information made our underground transition from optional to mandatory. The upper level might be habitable for a few more weeks, but it wouldn't remain viable through a winter that was going to be both longer and more severe than anything in recorded history. We needed to be fully established in the cave system before the surface became completely uninhabitable. Day 13 brought our first real crisis of the underground transition. David had been helping with the supply transfer, but the psychological pressure of working in the narrow confines of the cave system was overwhelming him. During what should have been a routine supply run, he panicked while descending through the shaft. He got halfway down and froze, unable to continue descending but too terrified to climb back up. I had to go down after him, talking him through the rest of the descent while Sarah coordinated from below. It took almost 2 hours to get him safely to the cave floor, and by the time we did, he was in complete psychological collapse. He couldn't handle the idea of living underground for months or years. The closed spaces, the artificial lighting, the separation from the surface world were triggering every claustrophobic instinct he had. Frank and Rose, who'd raised 3 children and understood the difference between reasonable fear and paralyzing panic, took charge of David's situation. They set up a sleeping area for him in the upper level and made it clear that he could remain on the surface as long as conditions allowed. But they also made it clear that when surface survival became impossible, he'd have to choose between the underground option and striking out on his own. That evening, while David was recovering upstairs and the rest of us were working on establishing our underground operations base, I made a discovery that explained both the mechanical sounds I'd been hearing and the reasons the original miners had sealed off certain sections of the cave system. I was exploring the workshop area, trying to understand how the various machinery connected to the overall cave ventilation system, when I found a maintenance log that had been left behind by the original miners. Unlike the official mining company records, this was a personal journal kept by someone who'd been working in the caves right up until the final evacuation. The entries from 1923 described problems that hadn't been mentioned in the official documentation: gas accumulation in certain chambers, structural instability that seemed to worsen during storms. Most disturbing, equipment malfunctions that the maintenance crews couldn't explain or repair, machinery that would start running on its own, ventilation systems that would reverse direction without warning, lighting that would flicker in patterns that didn't match any electrical problems they could identify. But the final entries in the journal revealed something that made my understanding of our situation much more complicated. The problems weren't random equipment failures. They were systematic malfunctions that suggested the presence of something in the deeper cave system that was interfering with the mining operations. The maintenance crews had started finding evidence of previous human activity in areas that should have been virgin cave formations. According to the journal, the caves contained signs of much older occupation, tool marks that didn't match 1920s equipment, stone structures that appeared to be deliberately constructed but weren't part of the mining operation. Most unsettling, acoustic anomalies that suggested the cave system was much more extensive than their surveys had indicated, with connections to areas they'd never been able to locate or access. The miners had sealed off the problematic sections not just because of safety concerns, but because they discovered that they weren't the first people to use the cave system for survival purposes. Someone else had been there before them, possibly for decades or centuries, and the evidence suggested that those previous occupants might still be present somewhere in the deeper areas. On day 14, while I was processing the implications of what I'd found in the maintenance journal, we received an unwelcome visit that forced us to accelerate our underground transition. The Billings Survival Group returned, but this time they brought more people and a very different attitude. Tom and Linda were still part of the group, but they were no longer the primary decision makers. The group was now led by a man named Craig Mitchell, who introduced himself as a former military contractor with experience in resource management and territorial security. He was polite but firm in explaining that isolated groups like ours were inefficient uses of valuable resources, and that cooperation with larger, better-organized communities was no longer optional. Mitchell's group had grown to over 40 people, and they'd established what he called a regional resource coordination network. Smaller groups would contribute their supplies and specialized knowledge to the network in exchange for protection and access to larger supply reserves. Groups that refused to cooperate would be left to face the winter on their own, without access to trade, communication, or mutual assistance. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but Frank, who dealt with enough aggressive business practices to recognize extortion when he saw it, understood the real terms immediately: join their network and surrender control of our site and supplies, or face increasing pressure until we either submitted or were eliminated as a competing resource base. I told Mitchell that we needed time to consider his offer and discuss it as a group. He agreed to give us 48 hours to make our decision, but he made it clear that this was the only time he'd make the offer on cooperative terms. After that, resource allocation would be determined by factors other than voluntary participation. After they left, we held our first real strategic planning session. We had to assume that Mitchell's group would return in 2 days expecting either submission or resistance. We also had to assume that if we chose resistance, they'd be prepared to use force to acquire our resources. Our only advantage was information they didn't have: the existence and capabilities of the underground complex. Frank's assessment was blunt but accurate. We were 6 people, including one who was already psychologically compromised. They were 40 people with military organization and experience in territorial acquisition. In a straight confrontation, we'd lose quickly and decisively. Our only chance was to use advantages they didn't know we had: knowledge of the site, access to resources they couldn't locate, and the ability to operate from underground positions they couldn't assault effectively. That night, we implemented emergency protocols. We moved all critical supplies to the underground complex. We established concealed observation positions that would allow us to monitor the surface without being detected. Most importantly, we began serious exploration of the sealed sections of the cave system to determine what additional resources and defensive positions might be available. Day 15 brought discoveries that changed our understanding of both our situation and our options. While Sarah and Dr. Martinez worked on establishing communications and monitoring equipment in the main cave chambers, I began the systematic exploration of areas that the 1920s miners had considered too dangerous to access. The first sealed section I opened led to a natural limestone chamber that was larger than any of the areas we'd explored so far. But it wasn't empty. The chamber contained evidence of previous occupation that clearly predated the mining operation by decades, possibly centuries. Stone tools, primitive furniture, and cooking areas that had been carved directly into the cave walls. Someone had lived in these caves long before the miners arrived, and they'd lived there for extended periods. More importantly, they'd modified the cave system extensively. Natural passages had been widened and connected. Artificial chambers had been carved from solid rock. Ventilation shafts had been expanded to create complex air circulation systems. The previous occupants had turned the natural cave formation into a sophisticated underground habitat that could support a substantial population indefinitely. But they'd also left warning markers, symbols carved into the cave walls that clearly indicated dangerous areas, passages that had been deliberately collapsed to prevent access to certain sections, storage areas that had been sealed with heavy stone barriers and marked with what were obviously caution symbols. The maintenance journal from the 1920s made more sense now. The miners hadn't been dealing with random equipment malfunctions. They'd been discovering and accidentally interfering with systems that had been installed and maintained by previous cave occupants. The mechanical sounds I'd been hearing weren't from mining equipment. They were from much older systems that were still operational after possibly centuries of continuous use. As I explored deeper into the previously sealed areas, the evidence of long-term habitation became overwhelming. Multiple chambers equipped with sophisticated heating and ventilation systems, water collection and storage facilities that tapped into underground streams, food preservation areas that could maintain supplies for years, workshop spaces equipped with tools and equipment for manufacturing everything from clothing to complex mechanical devices. Whoever had lived in these caves before the miners arrived had built a complete underground civilization. They'd done it with primitive tools and manual labor, but they'd done it with a thoroughness and sophistication that put modern emergency planning to shame. They'd created a facility that could sustain hundreds of people through disasters that lasted for decades. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found clear evidence that the previous occupants hadn't just prepared for disasters. They'd survived them, multiple times. The cave system contained artifacts and construction from several different time periods, suggesting continuous occupation and expansion over centuries. Each generation had added to the facility, improving and expanding the systems left by their predecessors. The implications were staggering. The cave system wasn't just a survival shelter. It was a repository of knowledge and technology developed by people who'd faced and survived multiple catastrophic events. People who'd learned how to maintain civilization underground, while the surface world collapsed and rebuilt itself repeatedly. On day 16, while I was documenting my discoveries and trying to understand their implications for our current situation, Frank made a discovery that explained the mechanical sounds we'd been hearing and raised new questions about what else might be operational in the deeper cave system. He'd been working on understanding the ventilation system that served the main cave chambers when he found equipment that was clearly not from the 1920s mining operation. Hidden behind a false wall in one of the workshop areas, he discovered a mechanical facility that was sophisticated beyond anything that should have existed in the caves. The equipment was primitive in design, but advanced in engineering. Hand-operated machinery that could perform complex manufacturing tasks, water-powered systems that provided mechanical energy for tools and equipment. Most impressive, a clockwork-style mechanical system that appeared to be designed for long-term autonomous operation with minimal maintenance. Frank, who'd spent his career working with mechanical systems, was amazed by the engineering sophistication of what he found. The equipment was designed to operate reliably for decades with only basic maintenance and occasional manual input. It was built to last, built to be repaired with simple tools, and built to function even when its operators didn't fully understand how it worked. But it was also built to be hidden. The entire mechanical facility was concealed behind false walls and disguised entrances. Access required knowledge of specific procedures and locations that weren't obvious to casual exploration. The The previous cave occupants had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that their technology would remain hidden from people who weren't specifically looking for it. That evening, as we prepared for what might be our final night before Mitchell's group returned with ultimatums, I shared with our group what Frank and I had discovered in the sealed sections. The cave system was far more extensive and sophisticated than we'd realized. It contained resources and technology that could sustain us not just through the current volcanic winter, but through multiple disaster cycles that might extend for decades. But it also contained clear evidence that we weren't the first people to face this kind of situation, and we weren't the first people to seek survival in these particular caves. The previous occupants had dealt with disasters that required decades of underground survival, and they developed systems and knowledge that made such survival not just possible, but sustainable. Dr. Martinez, who'd been analyzing the construction techniques and engineering principles we discovered, pointed out something that none of us had wanted to acknowledge. The sophistication of the systems we'd found suggested that the previous occupants hadn't just survived individual disasters. They'd adapted to a world where surface survival was impossible for extended periods. They'd built a civilization designed for permanent underground habitation. That raised uncomfortable questions about what kind of disasters had required such extensive preparation, and whether the volcanic winter we were facing was part of a larger pattern of catastrophic events that occurred regularly enough to require permanent underground infrastructure. As we settled in for what might be our last night of relative peace before confronting Mitchell's ultimatum, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were about to discover answers to questions we hadn't known we needed to ask. The cave system contained not just resources for survival, but information about survival strategies developed over centuries of facing disasters that made our current crisis look like a minor inconvenience. Tomorrow, we'd have to choose between submission to Mitchell's resource coordination network or resistance from underground positions that might prove far more defensible than anyone expected. But tonight, listening to the steady mechanical sounds from the deeper cave system, I was beginning to understand that our choice wasn't just about surviving the current crisis. It was about deciding whether to continue trying to maintain surface world assumptions about normal life, or to accept that normal life might be permanently impossible and begin learning how to build something entirely different in its place. Day 17 arrived with a crisis that forced us to make decisions we weren't ready to make. David had been struggling with the psychological pressure of underground survival, but during the night, his condition deteriorated into complete breakdown. He'd attempted to climb out through the ventilation shaft on his own, without safety equipment or communication with the rest of us. Frank found him at dawn, unconscious at the bottom of the shaft with injuries that could have been fatal. We got David stabilized, but his attempted escape revealed the depth of his psychological collapse and created an immediate security problem. If Mitchell's group returned and found evidence that someone had been using the shaft, our entire underground operation would be compromised. More critically, David's injuries required medical attention that exceeded our first aid capabilities. We needed help that we couldn't provide, but seeking that help would expose us to exactly the kind of outside attention we were trying to avoid. Rose, who'd been a school nurse before she retired, did what she could with our limited medical supplies, but she was clear about David's condition. He had a concussion, possible internal injuries, and was going into shock. Without proper medical treatment, he might not survive the next 24 hours. With proper medical treatment, he might recover but would certainly reveal our location and capabilities to anyone who provided that treatment. The decision we faced was brutal but clear. We could try to save David by seeking outside medical help, which would compromise our security and probably result in losing our underground refuge to Mitchell's group. Or we could focus on protecting our long-term survival capabilities and accept that David's life was the price of maintaining our strategic advantages. Frank made the decision for us. He'd been in situations where individual needs had to be weighed against group survival, and he understood the mathematics of crisis resource allocation. We'd take David to the surface and make him as comfortable as possible, but we wouldn't seek outside help that would compromise the underground complex. If David survived with basic medical care, we'd reassess his situation. If he didn't, we'd learned a hard lesson about the psychological requirements for underground survival. That morning, while Rose stayed with David in a surface shelter we'd prepared for emergencies, the rest of us began the systematic exploration of the cave system areas that we'd identified as potentially critical for our long-term survival. What we found revolutionized our understanding of both our current situation and our future possibilities. The first major discovery came when Sarah and I opened a sealed chamber that was much larger than anything we'd found so far. It wasn't just a room. It was a complete underground facility that had been designed and built for permanent habitation by a substantial population. The chamber was easily large enough to house 50 people comfortably, with separate areas for sleeping, cooking, workshops, and storage. But the sophistication of the facility was what truly amazed us. The previous occupants had carved sleeping alcoves directly into the cave walls, each one equipped with ventilation, lighting, and privacy features that demonstrated advanced understanding of both engineering and human psychology. The cooking area was equipped with a complex chimney system that vented smoke through natural cave formations, without creating detectable surface emissions. The workshop areas contained tool storage and work surfaces that could support everything from basic crafts to complex manufacturing. Most impressive was the water management system. The previous occupants had identified and tapped into underground streams, creating a network of channels and storage areas that provided fresh water throughout the facility. They'd also created waste management systems that used natural biological processes to handle human waste without contaminating the water supply or creating health hazards. Dr. Martinez, who'd been analyzing the engineering principles behind what we'd found, was astounded by the sophistication of the construction. The previous occupants had understood principles of structural engineering, fluid dynamics, and environmental control that matched or exceeded modern standards. They'd built systems that were designed to function reliably for centuries with minimal maintenance. But they'd also built systems that were designed to be expanded and improved by future occupants. The facility contained clear instructions, carved into the cave walls in multiple languages, explaining how to maintain and modify the existing systems. More importantly, it contained detailed information about additional cave areas that could be developed for further expansion. The second major discovery came when Frank found what could only be described as a complete underground manufacturing facility. Hidden behind sealed passages that required specific knowledge to access, the previous occupants had created workshops equipped with machinery that could produce everything from simple tools to complex mechanical devices. The machinery was ingenious in its simplicity and durability. Hand-operated systems that could perform precision manufacturing tasks, water-powered equipment that used underground streams to provide mechanical energy. Most remarkable, modular manufacturing systems that could be reconfigured to produce different types of products depending on current needs. Frank, who understood manufacturing from his automotive background, recognized immediately that the previous occupants had solved the fundamental problem of maintaining technological capability without depending on external supply chains. They'd created a facility that could manufacture its own tools, maintain its own equipment, and produce everything needed for self-sufficient survival indefinitely. But the manufacturing facility also contained something that changed our understanding of why such extensive preparation had been necessary. The workshop areas contained examples of products that had been manufactured over multiple time periods, suggesting that the facility had been in continuous or repeated use for centuries. More disturbing, some of the manufactured items were clearly designed for defense against human threats rather than natural disasters. The previous occupants hadn't just been preparing for volcanic winters or climate disasters. They'd been preparing for social collapse, warfare, and extended periods when surface survival was impossible due to human, rather than natural causes. The facility was designed to sustain a population through decades of siege conditions, complete isolation from the outside world, and hostile surface environments that made any contact with external communities impossible. On day 18, while we were still processing the implications of what we discovered, Mitchell's group returned. But they didn't come with ultimatums or demands for cooperation. They came with desperation. Something had gone wrong with their resource coordination network, and they needed our help. Tom and Linda were back, but they looked exhausted and frightened. Mitchell was nowhere to be seen. According to Tom, their group had encountered problems that were forcing them to reconsider their entire approach to regional survival. Other groups in their network had been more aggressive and better organized than they'd expected. What had started as voluntary cooperation had turned into territorial warfare, with the strongest groups absorbing or eliminating weaker ones. Mitchell's group had been on the losing side of that consolidation. Their main base had been overrun by a larger group with military experience and superior weapons. Most of their supplies had been captured, and their members were scattered across the region trying to find temporary shelter. Tom and Linda had been sent to ask if we'd consider taking in some of their refugees in exchange for labor and whatever supplies they could contribute. The request put us in a difficult position. We now had resources and space that could theoretically support additional people, but we also had security concerns and operational secrets that couldn't be shared with outsiders. More importantly, accepting refugees from Mitchell's group would make us a target for the same aggressive groups that had overrun their operations. Frank's response was characteristically direct. We'd consider helping individuals who could contribute useful skills and accept our leadership, but we wouldn't get involved in the territorial conflicts between organized survival groups. Anyone who joined us would have to commit to our approach to survival and security, which meant accepting conditions and restrictions they might not like. That evening, while Tom and Linda rested in our surface shelter and considered our terms, I made a discovery in the cave system that explained both the mechanical sounds we'd been hearing and the reasons the previous occupants had been so concerned about security and concealment. I was exploring a passage that connected the main underground facility to areas we hadn't yet accessed when I found an operational control center that was still functioning after possibly centuries of continuous operation. The room contained mechanical systems that monitored and controlled various aspects of the underground facility: ventilation, water flow, temperature regulation, and most importantly, security. The security systems were sophisticated beyond anything I'd expected from pre-industrial construction. The previous occupants had created mechanical surveillance systems that could monitor surface activity around the cave entrances. They'd built early warning systems that could detect approaching people or vehicles. Most remarkably, they'd installed defensive systems that could seal off various sections of the cave complex if the facility was discovered or threatened. But the control center also contained records that explained why such extensive security measures had been necessary. The previous occupants had faced repeated threats from surface groups that wanted to acquire their resources and technology. They'd survived multiple siege attempts, raids, and infiltration efforts. The facility had been designed not just for survival, but for resistance against organized human threats that could persist for years. The records were primarily pictographic, but they were clear enough to understand the basic pattern. The previous occupants had faced cycles of surface disaster, followed by social collapse, followed by territorial warfare. During each cycle, they'd retreated to the underground facility and waited for the surface conflicts to resolve themselves. Sometimes that wait had lasted for decades. More disturbing, The records suggested that the current volcanic winter was part of a recurring pattern that the previous occupants had experienced multiple times. They developed their extensive underground infrastructure not for a single disaster, but for a repeating cycle of catastrophic events that made surface survival periodically impossible. On day 19, Tom and Linda made their decision to accept our terms and join our underground community. They brought valuable skills. Tom had experience with radio communications and electronics, while Linda had been a nurse practitioner before the disaster. But they also brought information that changed our understanding of the regional situation and our long-term security concerns. According to their reports, the territorial consolidation that had destroyed Mitchell's group was happening across the entire region. Multiple survival groups were being absorbed or eliminated by larger, more aggressive organizations that were focused on resource acquisition and territorial control. The cooperative approach to regional survival was being replaced by militarized competition between increasingly powerful groups. Worse, the successful groups were specifically targeting rural sites with existing infrastructure and resource potential. They were conducting systematic surveys of isolated locations, identifying targets for acquisition, and developing capabilities for assaulting defended positions. Our mining site fit exactly the profile of locations they were prioritizing for capture. That information made our underground capabilities not just advantageous, but essential for survival. The surface world was becoming too dangerous for small groups, regardless of their resources or defensive preparations. The only viable long-term strategy was to disappear completely from surface detection, while maintaining the capability to operate underground indefinitely. Dr. Martinez had been analyzing the climate data we could still receive from emergency broadcasts, and her latest projections were even grimmer than her previous assessments. The volcanic winter was not only persisting, but intensifying. Global temperatures were continuing to drop, and there were no signs of stabilization. The disaster was transitioning from an emergency to a permanent change in global climate conditions. Her analysis suggested that surface agriculture would be impossible for at least 5 years, possibly much longer. Most large population centers would become uninhabitable within months as heating fuel supplies were exhausted and food distribution systems collapsed completely. The disaster wasn't something that civilization would recover from in a few years. It was something that would require completely different approaches to human survival and social organization. That night, as our expanded group worked on integrating Tom and Linda into our underground operations, and David continued his slow recovery in the surface shelter, I reached a conclusion that would define everything we did from that point forward. We weren't just surviving a temporary emergency. We were transitioning to a permanent new way of life that might last for decades or longer. The previous occupants of the cave system had understood this. They'd built infrastructure for permanent underground civilization because they'd recognized that surface survival was subject to periodic catastrophic interruption. They developed technologies and social systems for maintaining human civilization under conditions that made traditional surface-based communities impossible. But they'd also left us something more valuable than infrastructure and technology. They'd left us a model for long-term thinking about survival and adaptation. They demonstrated that human civilization could persist and even thrive under conditions that seemed impossible, but only if people were willing to abandon assumptions about normal life and develop entirely new approaches to community organization and resource management. Day 20 brought the validation of our decision to commit fully to underground survival. David, who'd been recovering slowly in the surface shelter, was discovered by a patrol from one of the aggressive survival groups that had been conducting regional surveys. Rose, who'd been caring for him, managed to convince the patrol that David was just a refugee who'd been injured while traveling. But the encounter demonstrated that our surface facilities were no longer secure. More importantly, The patrol's presence meant that our location was now known to groups with the motivation and capability to return in force. We had perhaps days before organized attempts to acquire our resources would begin. Our window for maintaining the secret of our underground capabilities was closing rapidly. That afternoon, we implemented emergency protocols that we'd hoped never to use. We evacuated all remaining supplies and equipment from the surface facilities to the underground complex. We sealed the obvious access points and concealed any evidence of recent occupation. Most critically, we activated the defensive systems that the previous occupants had built to protect the facility from exactly this kind of threat. But we also discovered that the previous occupants had planned for exactly our situation. Hidden in the deepest areas of the cave system, we found emergency supplies and equipment that had been stockpiled specifically for periods when the facility would be under threat from hostile surface groups. Food, water, weapons, and tools that could sustain a besieged population for months while maintaining complete concealment from surface detection. The previous occupants hadn't just built a survival shelter. They'd built a fortress designed to protect human civilization during the kind of long-term catastrophic collapse that we were now experiencing. They'd anticipated that surface survival would become impossible, not just due to natural disasters, but due to the social collapse and territorial warfare that inevitably followed such disasters. As we prepared for what might be weeks or months of concealed underground survival, while hostile groups searched for and fought over surface resources, I realized that we discovered something more significant than a refuge from the volcanic winter. We'd found a repository of knowledge and capability that had been developed over centuries of facing exactly the kind of challenges we were now confronting. Tomorrow, we'd begin learning how to operate the full defensive and security capabilities of the underground facility. But tonight, listening to the steady mechanical sounds of systems that had been designed to function autonomously for decades, I understood that we were no longer just survivors of a volcanic winter. We were inheritors of a tradition of underground civilization that had been developed by people who'd faced and survived multiple cycles of surface world collapse. Day 21 marked the beginning of what I now understand was our real education in survival. Everything we'd learned during the first 20 days had been preparation. The discovery of the underground complex, the integration of new group members, the accumulation of resources and knowledge, all of that had been building toward the moment when we'd have to prove that underground civilization wasn't just possible, but sustainable under the worst conditions imaginable. That morning brought confirmation that our surface concealment efforts had been successful, but also evidence that our security situation was more precarious than we'd realized. Tom's radio monitoring equipment had detected increased communication traffic from the aggressive survival groups that were conducting regional surveys. They were systematically investigating every rural site with infrastructure potential, and they were using increasingly sophisticated methods to identify concealed resources and hidden populations. More disturbing, the radio traffic indicated that these groups had developed intelligence networks that shared information about target locations and defensive capabilities. They weren't just randomly raiding isolated sites. They were conducting coordinated operations based on detailed reconnaissance and strategic planning. Any group that revealed its location or capabilities would quickly become the target of organized assault by superior forces. But the radio traffic also revealed something that changed our understanding of the regional situation entirely. The aggressive groups weren't just competing with each other for resources. They were preparing for conflicts that would extend far beyond the current winter. They were building military capabilities and territorial control systems designed for long-term warfare in a post-collapse environment. The volcanic winter had triggered more than supply chain failures and infrastructure collapse. It had initiated a complete reorganization of human society based on resource scarcity and territorial competition. The groups that survived the current crisis would become the foundation for whatever civilization emerged from the disaster, and they were preparing to ensure that their version of civilization would be the one that prevailed. That realization made our underground capabilities not just tactically advantageous, but strategically essential. We weren't just hiding from immediate threats. We were preserving an alternative approach to post-disaster survival that might be the only thing standing between humanity and a future based entirely on militarized resource competition. David's condition had stabilized enough that we could move him to the underground facility, but his experience had taught us important lessons about the psychological requirements for long-term underground survival. Not everyone could adapt to extended isolation from the surface world. The mental and emotional pressures of underground life would eliminate some people regardless of their physical capabilities or technical skills. Rose, who'd been observing David's recovery and psychological state, identified several factors that seemed to determine who could successfully adapt to underground survival. Previous experience with confined spaces was helpful, but not essential. Acceptance of long-term thinking and delayed gratification was critical. Most importantly, the ability to find meaning and purpose in group survival rather than individual achievement seemed to be the determining factor for psychological stability. That afternoon, while Frank and Tom worked on understanding and activating the defensive systems we discovered in the control center, Sarah and I began the systematic exploration of cave areas that we'd identified as potentially containing additional resources or capabilities. What we found changed our understanding of both the previous occupants and the scope of what they'd accomplished. The cave system was far more extensive than even our expanded exploration had revealed. The previous occupants had connected natural cave formations across several miles of underground territory, creating a network of interconnected facilities that could support different aspects of long-term survival. We'd been operating in what was essentially the main residential and workshop complex, but it was only one component of a much larger underground civilization. The first major discovery was a complete agricultural facility that had been carved from natural cave formations and equipped with systems for growing food without sunlight or surface soil. The previous occupants had developed sophisticated techniques for mushroom cultivation, root vegetable production, and even limited grain growing using artificial lighting and carefully managed soil mixtures. But the agricultural facility was more than just a food production area. It was a complete ecosystem management system that used natural biological processes to maintain air quality, process waste, and regulate the underground environment. The previous occupants had created a closed-loop system that could sustain a substantial population indefinitely without any external inputs. Dr. Martinez, who'd been analyzing the engineering principles behind the agricultural systems, was amazed by the sophistication of the biological and environmental controls. The previous occupants had understood principles of ecology and biochemistry that allowed them to create artificial ecosystems that were more stable and productive than many natural environments. The second major discovery was a library and education facility that contained the accumulated knowledge and experience of centuries of underground survival. The previous occupants had developed written languages and recording systems that allowed them to preserve and transmit technical knowledge, cultural information, and historical experience across multiple generations. The library contained detailed instructions for every aspect of underground civilization, engineering and construction techniques, agricultural and manufacturing processes, medical and health management systems, and most importantly, social organization principles for maintaining community cohesion during extended isolation and stress. But the library also contained historical records that explained why such extensive preparation had been necessary and what we could expect from future developments. The previous occupants had faced multiple cycles of surface disaster and social collapse. They documented the patterns and characteristics of these cycles, creating a historical framework that could be used to predict and prepare for future catastrophic events. According to their records, the volcanic winter we were experiencing was part of a recurring pattern that occurred roughly every 2 to 3 centuries. Each cycle involved a period of surface environmental catastrophe followed by social collapse, territorial warfare, and eventual rebuilding. The cycles typically lasted between 20 and 50 years, with the underground phase lasting 5 to 15 years, depending on the severity of the initial disaster and the intensity of the subsequent conflicts. The previous occupants had survived multiple complete cycles, maintaining their underground civilization through decades of surface chaos, and emerging to help rebuild surface communities when conditions stabilized. They developed institutional knowledge and technological capabilities that made them valuable contributors to post-disaster reconstruction. But they'd also maintained the capability to retreat underground again when the next cycle began. On day 22, our defensive preparations were tested when Frank's monitoring systems detected the approach of an organized group that was conducting a systematic survey of our area. The group consisted of approximately 20 people with vehicles and communication equipment, and they were clearly following a predetermined search pattern that would eventually bring them to our concealed surface facilities. The defensive systems that the previous occupants had installed proved to be both sophisticated and effective. From the underground control center, we could monitor the surface group's movements without revealing our presence. More importantly, we could activate countermeasures that would mislead their search efforts and encourage them to move on to other areas without conducting detailed investigation of our site. The countermeasures were ingenious in their subtlety. Rather than obvious concealment that might trigger suspicion, the previous occupants had created systems that made the site appear to have been thoroughly searched and found worthless by previous groups. False evidence of failed scavenging attempts, concealed damage that suggested structural instability, and carefully placed indicators that the site had already been stripped of anything valuable. But the most effective countermeasure was environmental. The previous occupants had developed techniques for using natural cave acoustics and air circulation to create surface effects that would discourage extended investigation. Subtle sounds that suggested structural instability, air currents that carried odors suggesting decay or contamination, and temperature variations that made the area uncomfortable for surface camping. The surface group spent 6 hours investigating our area, but the defensive countermeasures convinced them that the site had no value and significant hazards. They moved on without discovering any evidence of our underground operations, and their radio communications indicated that they'd marked our location as searched and worthless. That success demonstrated the effectiveness of the concealment and defensive systems, but it also revealed the sophistication of the threats we were facing. The surface group had been equipped with detection equipment and search techniques that would have discovered conventional concealment efforts. Only the advanced countermeasures developed by the previous occupants had been sufficient to maintain our security. Day 23 brought the discovery that changed our understanding of our situation from temporary crisis management to permanent lifestyle transition. Linda, who'd been working with Dr. Martinez to analyze the agricultural and ecosystem management systems, made calculations that revealed the true scope of what the previous occupants had accomplished. The underground facility could sustain a population of up to 60 people indefinitely without any external inputs. The agricultural systems could produce enough food to maintain health and nutrition. The manufacturing capabilities could produce all necessary tools, equipment, and materials. The water management systems could provide unlimited fresh water. Most importantly, the waste processing and environmental control systems could maintain air quality and ecosystem stability for centuries of continuous operation. But the facility could also be expanded to support larger populations if necessary. The previous occupants had designed the systems to be scalable, with clear instructions for adding additional agricultural areas, residential spaces, and manufacturing capabilities. The cave system contained enough undeveloped area to support a community of several hundred people if the need arose. That information transformed our perspective on what we were doing. We weren't just surviving a temporary disaster. We were establishing the foundation for a permanent underground civilization that could persist and grow regardless of surface conditions. We had the resources and knowledge to create a community that would be completely independent of the surface world for as long as necessary. But Linda's analysis also revealed something more significant. The agricultural and ecosystem systems weren't just designed for sustaining existing populations. They were designed for education and development. The previous occupants had created facilities for training people in underground survival techniques, for conducting research and development of new technologies, and for maintaining and expanding the knowledge base that made long-term underground civilization possible. We weren't just inheriting a survival shelter. We were inheriting an institution dedicated to preserving and developing human civilization under conditions that made surface survival impossible. The previous occupants had created something equivalent to a university, research center, and cultural preservation facility that happened to also be a fortress and survival complex. On day 24, while our group was working on understanding and integrating the full capabilities of the facility, we encountered evidence that we weren't the only people who discovered the potential of underground survival. Tom's radio monitoring detected communications from other groups that had found similar cave systems and were developing comparable underground capabilities. But the communications also revealed something more disturbing. Some of the groups that had discovered underground facilities were using them as bases for aggressive surface operations rather than peaceful survival communities. They were treating underground security as a tactical advantage for territorial warfare rather than a refuge from that warfare. The implications were troubling. If aggressive groups gained access to underground facilities comparable to ours, they'd become virtually impossible to defeat or eliminate. They could conduct surface raids and territorial acquisition with complete security for their base operations. The underground advantage that we viewed as protection from territorial warfare could be used by others to make territorial warfare more effective and destructive. That realization made our choice of community values and organizational principles more critical than we'd understood. The technical capabilities of underground civilization could be used to support either cooperative survival communities or aggressive territorial organizations. The difference would be determined by the social and cultural principles that guided the use of those capabilities. Frank, who'd been thinking about the long-term implications of what we'd discovered, raised the question that none of us had wanted to confront directly. What were our responsibilities to other potential survivors who might need access to underground facilities? Did we have an obligation to share what we'd learned, or did security concerns require us to maintain complete secrecy about our capabilities? The question became more than theoretical when David, who'd recovered enough to participate in group discussions, reported that he'd been contacted by his sister through emergency radio networks. She was part of a group of university faculty and graduate students who'd been trying to establish a survival community near Missoula, but they were facing increasing pressure from territorial groups and needed more secure facilities. David's report created our first real test of community decision-making under crisis conditions. We had the capability to help additional people, but helping them would require revealing our location and capabilities to outsiders. We also had to consider whether we could trust newcomers with the knowledge and resources we'd accumulated, and whether expansion would compromise the security and sustainability of our existing operations. The discussion that followed revealed different perspectives on the fundamental purpose of what we were building. Some group members viewed our underground community as a survival refuge that should be protected by maintaining small size and strict secrecy. Others saw it as the foundation for rebuilding civilization and believed we had responsibilities to help other survivors access comparable capabilities. Rose, who'd become our informal coordinator for community decisions, pointed out that the previous occupants had faced similar decisions multiple times. The historical records in the library contained accounts of periods when the underground community had expanded to help other survivors, and periods when security concerns had required isolation and secrecy. According to those records, the previous occupants had developed decision-making criteria based on the specific characteristics of the surface situation and the potential compatibility of newcomers with underground community values. During periods of intense territorial warfare, they'd maintained strict isolation. During periods of social rebuilding, they'd actively recruited compatible individuals and groups. Day 25 brought the resolution of David's sister's situation in a way that demonstrated the harsh realities of survival decision-making under crisis conditions. Her group had been overrun by one of the aggressive territorial organizations, and most of her companions had been killed or captured. She'd escaped with 3 other survivors, but they were injured, without supplies, and being pursued by hostile forces. David requested permission to attempt a rescue operation that would bring his sister and her companions to our facility. The request forced us to make the kind of decision that would define our community's character and future development. We could attempt the rescue, which would risk exposing our location and capabilities to hostile forces. Or we could refuse, which would mean accepting that our security required sacrificing people we might be able to save. Frank made the decision that probably saved our community from destruction. He pointed out that rescue operations under the current conditions would almost certainly result in leading hostile forces directly to our location. Instead of attempting rescue, we'd provide David's sister with information about alternative survival resources and techniques that might help her group establish independent underground capabilities. The decision was heartbreaking for David, but it was also educational for our entire community. Underground survival required different moral calculations than surface survival. The security requirements for maintaining long-term underground civilization sometimes conflicted with immediate humanitarian impulses. Learning to make those calculations correctly was part of adapting to our new way of life. But Frank's alternative suggestion proved to be more significant than any of us realized at the time. The information we provided to David's sister included basic techniques for identifying and accessing natural cave systems that could be developed for survival purposes. We also included references to the historical patterns and characteristics that indicated areas where previous underground communities might have left behind facilities and resources. That information represented our first attempt to share the knowledge we'd gained without compromising our own security. Instead of bringing people to our facility, we were helping them develop their own underground capabilities using the principles and techniques we'd learned from the previous occupants. Day 26 brought news that our approach to helping other survivors was already producing results. David's sister had successfully located a cave system that showed signs of previous human modification, and her group was beginning to develop underground survival capabilities based on the information we'd provided. More importantly, she'd shared that information with other survival groups that were facing similar security pressures. Tom's radio monitoring detected communications from multiple groups that were beginning to explore underground survival options. Some were following our guidance about identifying and developing natural cave systems. Others were discovering that rural areas contained abandoned facilities that could be converted for underground use. The concept of underground survival was spreading across the region, as groups learned that surface territorial warfare made conventional survival communities impossible to maintain. But the spread of underground survival techniques also created new challenges and opportunities. Groups that successfully established underground capabilities would become potential allies for mutual support and resource sharing. Groups that failed to develop adequate underground security would become increasingly desperate and dangerous as surface resources were exhausted. Dr. Martinez had been analyzing the regional situation based on radio communications and climate data, and her projections suggested that we were entering a critical transition period. Surface territorial warfare was reaching the point where organized groups were consolidating control over large areas. Within the next few months, most surface resources would be controlled by militarized organizations that would view underground communities as either potential assets to be acquired or threats to be eliminated. The groups that survived the transition would be those that achieved either complete underground concealment or sufficient surface military capability to defend their territories against all challengers. There would be no middle ground for small survival communities that remained visible to surface detection, but lacked adequate defensive capabilities. That analysis made our underground development not just tactically smart, but strategically essential for long-term survival. But it also suggested that we needed to begin thinking beyond immediate survival toward the kind of post-disaster reconstruction that would eventually be necessary when surface conditions stabilized. Day 27 brought the first contact from another underground community that had successfully established capabilities comparable to ours. The group was located approximately 50 miles from our position and had discovered a cave system that contained evidence of previous occupation and modification. They'd used our shared information to develop basic underground survival capabilities and were requesting additional technical guidance for expanding their operations. The contact was made through encrypted radio communications, using protocols that Tom had developed for secure intergroup coordination. The other group demonstrated knowledge of underground survival principles that indicated they'd successfully implemented the techniques we'd shared. But they also had questions about advanced systems that suggested they'd discovered additional resources or capabilities. More importantly, the other group reported that they'd made contact with 3 additional underground communities that were developing in the region. The underground survival approach was creating a network of independent but cooperative communities that shared information and resources while maintaining individual security and autonomy. Frank recognized immediately that this development could change the entire regional survival situation. Instead of surface territorial warfare between competing militarized groups, the region could develop a network of underground communities that avoided territorial conflicts by maintaining concealment and focusing on technological development rather than resource acquisition. But network development also required coordination and standardization that would be challenging to achieve while maintaining security. The underground communities needed common communication protocols, compatible technical standards, and shared decision-making processes for regional coordination. They also needed methods for verifying the reliability and compatibility of potential network members. Day 28 brought the discovery that resolved many of our questions about network development and regional coordination. Sarah had been working on translating additional sections of the historical records in the library when she found documentation of a previous period, when the original occupants had coordinated with multiple underground communities across a much larger geographical area. The records described a network of underground communities that had operated across several states during a previous cycle of surface catastrophe and social collapse. The network had included communities in various types of underground facilities, natural cave systems, modified mining operations, purpose-built underground installations, and even converted urban infrastructure. The historical network had developed sophisticated systems for secure communication, resource sharing, technical coordination, and mutual defense against surface threats. Most importantly, they developed protocols for network expansion that allowed new communities to join, while maintaining security and compatibility with existing operations. But the historical records also contained information that explained why such extensive underground network development had been necessary. The previous cycle of surface catastrophe had lasted for 37 years. The initial environmental disaster had triggered social collapse and territorial warfare that had persisted for decades before surface conditions stabilized enough for reconstruction to begin. The underground communities had maintained civilization not just through the initial disaster, but through decades of surface chaos that followed. They'd preserved technological knowledge, cultural traditions, and social institutions that became the foundation for eventual reconstruction when surface survival became possible again. The implications for our current situation were sobering. The volcanic winter that had triggered our underground transition was just the beginning of a process that could last for decades. The underground communities that survived and developed during this period would become the repositories of human civilization and the foundation for whatever society emerged from the catastrophe. Day 29 brought the implementation of our first formal protocols for regional underground network coordination. Using the historical models we discovered, we established communication and coordination procedures with the 4 other underground communities that had been identified in our area. The network included our facility, the community that David's sister had helped establish, and 3 other groups that had successfully developed underground capabilities. The initial network coordination focused on information sharing and technical assistance, rather than resource pooling or operational integration. Each community maintained complete autonomy and security for their own operations, while contributing to shared databases of technical knowledge, regional intelligence, and coordination protocols. But network coordination also revealed the diversity of approaches to underground survival that different groups had developed. Some communities had focused on advanced agricultural systems and were producing food surpluses that could support larger populations. Others had emphasized manufacturing capabilities and were producing tools and equipment that could be shared across the network. Still, others had developed specialized capabilities for education, research, or cultural preservation. The diversity of specialization suggested that the underground network could become more than just a survival strategy. It could become the foundation for a technologically advanced civilization that was specifically adapted to post-disaster conditions and immune to the territorial conflicts that made surface communities vulnerable. Tom's analysis of regional communication traffic indicated that surface territorial warfare was reaching the consolidation phase that Dr. Martinez had predicted. Large militarized groups were establishing stable control over substantial territories, eliminating smaller competing groups, and beginning to focus on long-term resource management rather than short-term acquisition. But the surface consolidation also created opportunities for underground communities to begin planning for eventual emergence and reconstruction. The territorial groups that survived the consolidation phase would become the political and military powers in the post-disaster world, but they would need the technological knowledge and cultural continuity that the underground communities had preserved. Day 30 marked the end of our first month of underground survival, but it also marked the beginning of our understanding of what we'd actually accomplished. We hadn't just survived a volcanic winter. We'd discovered and developed capabilities for maintaining human civilization under conditions that made surface survival impossible. We'd established connections with other communities that shared our approach, and were building a network that could preserve and develop human knowledge and culture through decades of surface chaos. But most importantly, we'd learned that disaster and collapse aren't just destructive forces. They're also selective pressures that determine which approaches to human organization and survival will persist into the future. The underground communities that were developing across the region represented a fundamentally different approach to civilization that was specifically adapted to the new realities of post-disaster survival. The previous occupants of our facility had left us more than infrastructure and resources. They'd left us a model for long-term thinking about civilization and survival that looked beyond immediate crisis management toward the kind of society that could emerge from catastrophic change. They demonstrated that human civilization could persist and even advance under conditions that seemed impossible, but only if people were willing to abandon assumptions about normal life and develop entirely new approaches to community organization and technological development. As I reflected on everything we'd learned and accomplished during our first 30 days underground, I realized that we were no longer just survivors of the volcanic winter. We were pioneers of a new kind of human civilization that was designed to be resilient against the catastrophic changes that were becoming the defining characteristic of our world. We discovered that the end of one kind of civilization could be the beginning of something entirely different and potentially much more durable. The volcanic winter that had driven us underground was just the first chapter of a much longer story about adaptation and survival. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, as we learned to build and maintain a civilization that could thrive in a world where surface survival was no longer reliable and underground capabilities had become the foundation for long-term human persistence. But tonight, listening to the steady mechanical sounds of systems that had been designed to function for centuries, I understood that we'd inherited something precious: the knowledge and capability to ensure that human civilization would persist regardless of what catastrophic changes the future might bring.